Okay, hello everybody, and I hope, is this working? I have no idea. I hope you all enjoyed the screening of the film. Robert Ryder, who you've just heard, who runs the cinemas here, was telling me about the response that was received for this anniversary screening. 12,000 of you responded to the request for favourite films, including 5,000 mini reviews of the films in question, and The Third Man came out first. But we were talking about this before, and about the nature of this film being one which people have very personal responses to it. And so when we're going to talk for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and then open it up not only to questions but to any kind of personal responses you have, favourite scenes, and so forth. So just quickly to introduce, on my left is Phillip French, who's a writer, author, and has been the film critic on The Observer for the past 30 years, and one of our most distinguished critics. And on my right, Frederick Baker, who's the director of a documentary film called Shadowing the Third Man, which, as we'll hear later, is being shown in Vienna at the moment. Philip, that is a wonderful reminder of the film before it became indelibly known to all of us. You know, I can't think that there are many people who don't recognise, even if they haven't seen the film, which is difficult to believe, the Zither score at least. But let's go back to 49, 50. When did you first see the film?
I first saw it a couple of weeks after it had come out, and it was eagerly anticipated, not merely because it had good reviews in the national newspapers, but it had won the prize, not then called the Palme d'Or, at Cannes in May. But it was by the most distinguished British director at that time, a person considered one of the world's greatest directors, Carol Reed. It was his fourth film since the sort of hiatus of the war, that he went with, in 1944 he made The Way Ahead, and then what may well be his best film, Odd Man Out, his film about the IRA in Belfast. Then the first of his three films with Graham Greene, The Fallen Idol, and then The Third Man. It not only was it a marvelous and original thriller, but it was about the world in which we were living at that time. I was 16 when I saw it. I came out of the cinema in Bristol into something like a bombed, the wreckage of Vienna. The cinema that I saw it at there was nothing between the street in which it stood and the docks in Bristol. It was like walking through the set of The Third Man, and then getting home to in the time of austerity, to have what our rationed food. Rationing was still very widespread at that time. Most things were being rationed. The film had an immediate popular impact. It not only had a very warm reception by the critics, though there was quite a number of snide remarks made about its style, which was considered pretentious, even by the writers, and particularly one of my predecessors, C. L. Lejeune, in The Observer. But it proved both a big critical success and a box office success, but on top of that, something of a phenomenon. That there was a sort of zither mania came out, spread around the country. Harry Lime became a popular figure. There was a Giles cartoon in the Sunday Express, then a paper with 4 million circulation, of a little boy on a building site, and he's trespassing, and he's in some kind of drainage tunnel, and there's a cop standing there calling out the little kids, said, "Come on out, Harry Lime." And not only was the Anton Karas's performance on the Zither popular best-selling record, but the Max Miller, the musical star, the cheeky chappie, wrote a number which sold hundreds of thousands, called "Come Hither with Your Zither." And there was also, which is long forgotten, some lyrics actually written for Anton Karas's music. And it's still in my head. Actually, I jotted them down when we were having dinner, so if I could, perhaps I can say, which goes to something, it goes like this, sort of, it's the zither melody, everywhere you go they play, very, very soon the captivating tune steals your heart away. First it gets you tapping, then dancing merrily, you can't forget the zither melody.
Very good, bravo. Yes, the myth of Harry Lime seems to kind of grow exponentially, and as you know, there are various spin-offs and a strange TV show. And but what's noticeable again in the trailer is the fact that Welles's name is not terribly prominent. It's on there. I mean, Selznick's name is very prominent. We might get to that, and Welles's name is mentioned, but there's no fuss made of Welles. And yet, in a sense, the film is, if it's about anything now, it's about that isn't the zither score. It's about the zither score and it's about Harry Lime. I mean, can you talk about the change there?
Well, Welles was by then a legendary figure. He had moved to Europe. He had just made one film that was entirely his own in Hollywood. All the subsequent films ran into trouble with producers and were cut, and he most significantly, Magnificent Amberson's cut by 30 minutes. But he had built up this fantastic reputation and a legend which sort of stood way above anything that he had done or we had seen. I hadn't seen, at the age of 15, 16, Citizen Kane, because it had been out of circulation. It was never available on 16mm for film societies. It had opened in a suburb of Liverpool where I was living in 1941. It was taken off after 3 days because nobody went to see it, or where it was killed, kind of by word of mouth, and considered hopelessly obscure. I didn't see it until, in fact, my first year at Oxford, my first week at Oxford. It hadn't been available. The same cinema began the year, the art house cinema in Oxford, began by showing for the first week and packed out the cinema Citizen Kane, which is when most of us saw it. But he was such a legendary figure which he created his own myth. And so a lot of the time when you first saw it, you knew that Welles was going to be in it. He was recognizable, and you were just actually waiting for Harry Lime. I mean, there were certain films, I mean, there's a curious thing, like Hitchcock's Psycho has this brilliant idea of killing off the major star half an hour into the movie. Carol Reed had this thing by the major star doesn't appear until 63 minutes into the movie.
Yeah, and if you look, it's a wonderfully rich period of cinema, the late 40s of British cinema, although this is a British-American co-production set outside the country. How do you rate The Third Man looking back at that period now? Is it, I mean, rate it in Reed's career and in British cinema?
Well, it seems to me that now the high point of both Greene and Reed's involvement with the movies. They both were connected with many films subsequently, and Reed was to enjoy, surprisingly, his greatest success in 1968-69 with Oliver. But I think that was his finest work was done in the immediate post-war years. It was. Well, it looks better now when the dross is washed away and leaving the gold there. It was an extraordinary year in some ways, 1949, that the Ealing comedy really came into its own with an opening in consecutive weeks of Passport to Pimlico, Whiskey Galore, and Kind Hearts and Coronets. That was still going around the country in a very sort of limited release. Powell and Pressburger's The Red Shoes. And they brought out then one of their best films in that year, what's the one about the yes, there was one about the boffins, the Small Back Room. And there was a film, but not his best, by David Lean. But The Third Man actually stood up above the others. When the first reviews came out, people said that the best film critic writing at that time, Richard Winnington in the News Chronicle, said, "I do not expect there to be a better film this year." And and at the end of the year, it was in his top 9 or 10 films. He said it was the best British movie. But the thing about it is that I think one of the richest things about the film is that every time you see the film, you see some new small detail in the picture, or see it in a different kind of way. I mean, I'd seen the film numerous occasions before I actually noticed that, for example, it's an extraordinary erotic touch of Valley lying in bed wearing Harry Lime's monogrammed pajamas. Little things like Holly Martins walking under under a ladder when he first comes to Harry's house. And curious parallels. I hadn't noticed it until I saw it today when he came home to me, that how the final scene, the long take of Valley coming down the road from the cemetery, which was a last-minute thought on the part of Carol Reed that Greene was opposed to this, but how that, in fact, is an echo of the first proper meeting between Harry and Holly Martins, who is taking up much the same position, a kind of passive waiting position you have in the far distance, right across the fairground, the appearance of Welles as Harry Lime, and how almost in real time, I think there were just 3 cuts, but almost in real time, he crosses this large distance before they have their first words.
And Frederick Baker, you've spent several years making a documentary about the film, and how has your experience of the film evolved through that prolonged exposure to it?
Well, I first saw the film in Vienna, where it was made, and there were no bomb sites. It was a prosperous city, and for me it was part of the history when I moved to Vienna of actually finding out what had gone there. And obviously The Third Man was a legend. I think, like for all of us, it's something that each generation kind of has to know about. So I kind of first saw it as a history film, and then I was invited to work on a book, and out of that developed this film. And for me it became more and more a kind of a masterpiece that's an example of an international co-production, because it really is, there's American stars and money in there. It's a Hollywood film, but it's also directed from Alexander Korda, a British producer who's actually originally Hungarian, but had actually learnt to direct in Vienna. And then there were the Vienna film schools, and myself being half Austrian, half British, it seemed sort of an ideal version. And I think what's interesting is that you can't see it in this version, but when you hear German in this film, Anna's landlady, everything she says is absolute apposite and is relevant, and is actually, and you say it was a film of your time and your age, is absolutely what maybe people in Baghdad would be saying about the Americans today, which is basically complaining that the people had been there too long and that they'd expected something different and they should all get out, and people were frustrated. So there were all these elements and these details, exactly as you say, that were actually very true to life. And I don't know if any of you have been to Vienna, but you'll see that the gratings in the streets are exactly the same as the ones in the film. And if you've ever been down in the sewers, which I did when I made my film, you'll every time you walk past one of those gratings and it's rather hot, it's exactly the same smell that comes up.
Yes, in your film, you run subtitles, which of course aren't in the release of the film, and part of its effect is it would have a different effect if it had subtitles. But Hedvig Bleibtreu says at one point, as you were saying about the Iraq, says, I thought the occupation was going to be a bit different from this,
yes,
in rather
yes.
kind of understatement. It's as you say, a co-production, but it's also a kind of example of collaboration and of kind of highly successful filmmaking where everything gels together. Now, I mean, you're a filmmaker. How do you think it sort of sums up a certain kind of moment in filmmaking and a certain kind of practice in filmmaking?
Well, I think it's absolutely on the cusp between where you take the skills of people like Krasker and all the the crew, because so many of these shots were doubled up in Shepperton. Most of the shots in the sewers that you've seen were actually done on stage 1 in Shepperton Studios here in London. And the water that Harry dies in is not the water of the Danube or anything to do with Vienna, but it's actually Thames water. Because Orson Welles refused to film very much in the real sewers. He was afraid of catching a disease or something. The British crew had been down there for weeks. They didn't have a problem at all. No, I mean, you had all of that craft to be able to actually do that. And then you had the spirit of the age of actually taking the cameras and going to real locations. And I call this sort of one of the first British neo-realist films. And we have to know that in Italy at this time, Rossellini and De Sica, etc., and Visconti were working on real locations in a documentary style. Of course, in Britain, there'd been a great documentary tradition during the war as well. And in a sense, I think that's a kind of a flavour that comes in. And I know Reed was really excited by the number of bomb sites. And actually, when they came to film in Vienna, there were less than when he'd gone to do the recce, so he was a bit disappointed. But there was that spirit there to actually enjoy that. And I think that's one of the points where it's absolutely a pointer to the future, and I think my own generation's filmmaking, where Carroll goes, he's at a party, he hears this weird instrument, the zither, that nobody's ever heard of, but that you just get when you go to one of the wine pubs in Vienna, and says, I want a bit of local colour. Find me that man, come and play that music. I want real locations. All of the extras that you see in the films actually are dossers who are out of the Doss house. I know this because in my film, Shadowing the Third Man, I was lucky enough to talk to Guy Hamilton, who later went on to do lots of Bond movies, but he learnt under Reed, and his job was to go to the Doss house and find the right faces, interesting faces for the cutaways during the taxi sequence. So there's all that documentary realism, which is absolutely contemporary, also in there. And I think you had all of that coming together. Obviously, then you have the traditions of Korda, you have Selznick as someone who knows how to make films, but wants to make European films. I mean, Selznick, the trailer you see, to be fair, is the American trailer. That was not the British trailer. Selznick recut the film, made Holly more acceptable, cut down on the drinking, cut any attacks on the Americans, which there were in the films. And this is the trailer that you saw. But even so, Selznick was actually rather ambitious and did want to work with Europe. So you had him in there. You had Alexander Korda, who, as I say, had been working in the 20s and 30s. And then you had some very young, talented people who were going on like Hamilton, like Guy Hamilton, who were going on to work. So, and then you had the location. I mean, in Austria, they were desperate to have films done. They had a film industry left over, and they were desperate to get on with it. And so, for example, all those wet streets, it was the local fire brigade. If your house had burnt down while the Third Man was being shot in Vienna at this time, you probably would have not had the fire brigade there, because they were all out helping Carroll Reed hose down the streets so he could get one more stop on his camera.
We have done the announced 15 minutes. I will open up, even though there's much more we could say. I think I will say that both that trailer and Frederick's film are available on the last year re-released Optimum DVD of The Third Man. So,
but it was interesting to see the trailer, that in the British trailer, it says produced by Alexander Korda and David Selznick. The American says produced by David O. Selznick and Alexander Korda.
That's right, and there was a lot of wrangling about that, which is, as Krasker won the Oscar for cinematography, and it's generally thought that The Third Man didn't win any other Oscars, although it did win the first Palme d'Or, as you say, because the wrangles between Korda and Selznick prevented a big publicity campaign. But I think we can certainly talk more, but let's open it now for any comments and questions to Philip and Frederick. Yeah, over here and then up there. Yep.
How far Welles had an influence on the movie, or was he just picking up a script and doing it?
Well, I mean, the biggest contribution, of course, it was that he made, and I think it was initially, or probably ad-libbed on the set, was his speech, in fact, his farewell remarks after they've come down off the wheel, his farewell remarks to Holly Martins about the the Renaissance and Leonardo and Switzerland and the cuckoo clock. That was entirely his, which Greene acknowledged initially when he published the book. The book, the novella, came out after the film had opened, and he said that you'll miss this particular line because I didn't write it in my scenario. It was added by Mr. Welles. Subsequently, in the collected edition, Greene neglects to say this. I think he felt that in some ways the film had been taken away from him, was not too much had been added by other people. There was talk about the influence of Welles at the time on the cinematography, and particularly the framing, the tilted cameras, though it is more likely that this came from films that were greatly admired by both Greene and Carol Reed, which were two films of the mid-20s by Julien de Vivier, Carnet de Bâle, and Pepe Le Moko.
Well, on that point, I mean, the tilted camera, I was with Guy Hamilton and Angela Allen in Vienna when they were there about 3 years ago, and so we went to the locations, and Guy confirmed that it was actually Carol Reed directly who said to the cameraman, well, why don't we try it with a tilted angle? And they actually shot apparently everything tilted, but also everything straight, just in case. So there for other directors, I think I would have done the same. But I think what Guy says about Orson's presence is actually that his absence helped massively, because he was wrangling so much with Alexander Korda over his fee and was actually hiding in Rome at the time. The camera crew had lots of time on their hands, and it gave them time to actually start experiment like tilting the camera, and it actually gave time for actually the director to watch what these shadows were doing. You know, the shadows were not initially there as an idea, but because they had time on their hands, they were able to do that, and Carol Reed built that into the idea. So in a typical Harry Lime fashion, he was present through his absence.
And just to add two small things, after the film was released, William Wyler, the Hollywood film director, sent Carol Reed a spirit level. And he said, you may like to use this in your next film. And also in your film, Frederick, there's a nice clip of Welles himself, and I think this is characteristic of all the people involved in the film, where he's at great pains to give credit where credit's due and not to take too much credit. He says, it's said that I had a hand in directing my own scenes in this film, but that's not the case. And then he says, but I did write my own part, which is a
complete lie.
A complete lie. It was an improvisation.
And he doesn't blink while doing it. I've watched it several times.
But it is, it's very much, all the people involved in the film speak incredibly highly of each other and of the experience of making the film, and I think it is rather in the kind of rather magical, alchemical way, it sort of is visible in the screen. But I think there was a question up here, yes.
Well, he was. I mean, the Greene wrote the story so that the hounding down and the use of the sewers and the knowledge of the sewers was Graham Greene's, and there are various stories as to where he got that idea and information. But Greene did go out as a journalist and actually do a recce, and did actually. It was British military control, and went with the British military police and maybe his friends and colleagues from MI5 to actually check this out. So Greene would have known about it, but the actual framing and the filming is all Carol Reed. And I think actually has its depths in expressionist cinema.
But of course, Greene did, on his recce visit to Vienna, make the two crucial discoveries. One, of course, was the illegal trade in penicillin, and the other was the discovery of the sewers. Though I think it is possible that having discovered the sewers, what the idea that they were there and you could get from different zones via the sewers, I think almost certainly what came to mind, or certainly was there near the surface of his subconscious mind was the pursuit in the sewers in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables.
I mean, the sewers are a gift, and they were part. I mean, he knew he was staying. He knew the military police. The Hotel Sacher that you see in the film was. It's absolutely historically true what you see in the film. Austrians were not allowed in there. It was a military zone. They weren't making the famous cake there at the time. That wasn't down to the British cooks. But no Austrians were allowed. And so the British military had huge amounts of problems because the entries to the sewers were not allowed to be locked, and it was the Russians that were blocking this, so the story goes, because the Russians were using it to actually get agents, etc., between the different zones, because Vienna was divided into 4 zones, and the central district, the first district where we are, was the only one that was international. And of course this was great for spies to get through, so it would have been something that his colleagues would have complained about all the time. Potentially, but
The only other one I'm thinking of is the Polish film Canal.
I mean, of all the people I've spoken to over the past 6 years researching this, no one's ever made that link. It's potential, but there is actually one particular character who was the Times journalist who'd actually been in Vienna in the Austrian Civil War in 1934. And during the Austrian Civil War, the sewers were used by the Marxist Social Democratic troops to actually get out. And these friends of Graham Greene having lots of contacts to the left, he probably would have found out about that. And there's one particular friend of his who was in Vienna at this time, who later became famous as Kim Philby. And that might be a closer link.
To the best of my knowledge, there's never been what there perhaps should be, which is a season here at the Barbican or the National Film Theatre of sewer movies, perhaps with Canal and the American film Noir, He Walks by Night, and of course a very famous sewer scene just a year before The Third Man, which is the Ealing comedy, in fact the first distinctive Ealing comedy, Hue and Cry.
My understanding from, I think, from Charles Drazen's book is that what interested Greene at first, or piqued his interest, was this idea that the sewer had its own police.
Yes.
And so it was kind of the idea of the sewer police. But it's one of these things one can trace back the kind of incidents whereby someone may have heard of it for the first time, and yet in the film itself, it's this wonderfully symbolic. I mean, in a sense, it's a descent into hell, and as someone said to me the other day, there's a quality of it of the sewer as a kind of backstage, and Harry Lime is such a kind of theatrical person, and now he's like the Phantom of the Opera, kind of reduced to scurrying around in the tunnels below and so forth. Are there other questions, thoughts?
The child was improvised. Carol Reed had previously worked with a very good child in Fallen Idol.
Probably
so he was very skilled at working with child actors. He knew how to motivate children in that form. And he was actually the son of one of the lighting guys. As I said earlier, that there was actually a huge input from the Austrian studios, all the lights, all the electricians, all of that equipment, apart from the big powerful lights, came from there. And he was a kind of little cheeky chappy around the site, and Carol, with time on his hands sometimes, but also this bolting together, this improvisational spirit, saw that he could become useful, and actually used him, and he worked obviously brilliantly. I agree. He's an absolute central figure, and he's still alive actually in Vienna. So I met him a few years ago.
But children are a recurrent feature.
Yes.
In Reed's films over a long period. The ambivalence of the innocence of children, and also their sort of the dangers that arise from this innocence. You've got with the Bobby Henry character, who actually nearly sends, in The Fallen Idol, nearly sends Baines, the butler, to the gallows. You have the children around Johnny McQueen in Odd Man Out in Belfast streets and begging of him, and the child who actually leads Dennis, the man looking for Johnny, to him in the shelter. And then in the film in which Reed attempted 4 years later in 1953 to almost recapitulate, rework the major themes and settings of The Third Man in Berlin, The Man Between. There was this child who was there, who idolizes the man between, this spy figure who operates again between East and West Berlin, played by James Mason, and how he, but while idolizing him, as the boy does in The Fallen Idol, then actually helps bring about the man he works with, the hero, brings about his death.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the points that you can see with a lot of these details is that Carol Reed was incredibly lucky to have Alexander Korda as his producer. And he absolutely, David Selznick in Hollywood, was a very interfering sort of director. And he used to send long memos as to what should happen, even to the colour of Holly Martin's socks across to London. And all of those interventions stopped in London and didn't get to Vienna, and allowed actually Carol Reed to do all this sort of improvisation as to what was right. And was improvisation. I mean, talking to Guy Hamilton, they did not know they were making a classic. They did not have many particularly intellectual thoughts about getting it done. It was a thriller. It was the next film to be got on with. And they were improvising as to what would work. And so, you know, he hears a zither, he uses a zither music. He sees there's a kid that's got a face, it functions. He picks that up. He works with that. Those are, you know, that's kind of, I think, a good tradition of British filmmaking.
And the child also, I mean, this kind of rather macabre child is also kind of out of Greenland too. I mean, it's very much a Graham Greene type figure, the rather chilling child. There's one in The Power and the Glory as well. And if one thinks of the other films of the time, you know, and there's a kind of another I think very powerful element of The Third Man is it's very hard bitten. I mean, it has a kind of romance too. But if one thinks of the boys in Rome Open City and the kind of sadness there's none of that in The Third Man, or in this one particular child anyway. There's an edginess to it, and the way in which the film combines these different elements, the comedy, the thriller, the macabre, the romantic, and so forth, is amazing, really. But others, yes, over here.
Yeah, I just wanted just on what you were saying. I mean, it seems to me Graham Greene is always writing about kind of Catholic morality, and I wonder, you know, that it seems I'm one of those people you were saying you couldn't believe existed who hadn't seen the film before tonight, and I wonder if, you know, Orson Welles, with all of the fame and the kind of the glamour that he necessarily kind of brought with him, and the kind of romanticism of those great long shadows and stuff, I wonder if that character slightly, the pull of that character draws away from the Christian, you know, Catholic particularly morality that might have been the centre of the story otherwise. I wonder if Graham Greene, you know, condoned the casting of Orson Welles, or I don't know if there's any sort of record of his thoughts on it.
So whether the character of Harry Lime sort of punctures the kind of morality that might otherwise have been there.
With the glamour of Welles.
Yeah. I think that's right.
The
conundrum of Harry Lime and in Welles's performance.
Yes. Well, in Greene's work, the character of Harry Lime goes right back to Greene's favourite book as a child, The Viper of Milan by Marjorie Byrne, in which the central character is a man of complete evil who actually enjoys to fulfill his evil acts, who's also Catholic, a character called Visconti, who then turns up as in Greene's great allegory, allegorical novel where he reviews all his work as the centre of the main character's search. It was called Visconti in Travels with My Aunt. And so but Greene is much more interested in people who are concerned with their own damnation than with their salvation. And there was a very strong sense in which Harry sort of embraces his fate in a way that the disingenuous, the ingenuous but weak Holly Martins doesn't. And where Holly is a great self-deceiver, the evil with which he's engaged is something that is actually embraced by the witty and sardonic Harry, who there is the one discussion on religion in it, which takes place when they're looking down on the world, and that scene is almost like it is very, very like the temptation of Christ, and that he's talking about what would you do if you were given £20,000 for each of the people you could kill down there, and he is tempting Holly, as he had, of course, earlier led him astray.
I mean, Graham Greene had absolutely nothing to do with the casting. That was Carol Reed's decision. In fact, Carol Reed went behind Selznick and Concordance back to get Orson Welles. Orson Welles at this time was box office poison in Hollywood. There was talk of I think it was Noel Coward getting the role. And actually, in the original novella, if you read it, Harry's an Englishman, not an American. And it was actually through this casting that Harry became an American. And we have, at the height of the Cold War, an American being protected by Stalin. This was Stalin still alive and kicking at this time in the Russian sector. And so this is how these amazing things happen. So it's actually, I think, in this sense, more cock-up theory rather than any particular grand design by Graham Greene. Graham Greene went, researched the story. He couldn't write it as a screenplay. He wrote it as a novella, and it was then turned into a screenplay by the studios. And he kind of washed his hands of it and said to Carol Reed, get on with it. So as I say, there are deep themes there, but some of those details are not Graham Greene.
But it is, in some ways, The Third Man is like Casablanca, in the sense that a lot of very happy accidents went into making it what it was, and when you see it now, it seems to have worked out perfectly. But there were, what would you think? What would The Third Man be like if Holly Martins had been played by Cary Grant, and Noel Coward was Harry Lye? As what would we still be looking at Casablanca now if the Rick was played by George Raft or Ronald Reagan?
Yes. Can I ask one question of you all? Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead. Go for it.
I had a showing of my film about a year ago in Paris, and I had the question as to how many times people in the audience had actually seen the film, and I'd like to start my bidding at 10 times. Could you raise your hands if you've seen the film 10 times? 1, 2, okay, 15. I've got one hand in the middle, one at the back. Okay, I think we've got 2 people at 15, haven't we? All right, can anyone go to 20? Sir, turn around. Could you please stand up, tell us how many times you've seen the film and why?
I don't know how many times I've seen it in total. I used to watch it as a child because it was always on at Christmas in the mid-60s on television. And I started watching it. I got a recording of it in about 1980 onto television and watched it ever since. A bit obsessive, possibly.
So would you say, have you seen it 30 times then?
I've lost count.
Oh, really?
Probably something like that, yes.
Because the maximum in Paris was 23. So, so London beats Paris, that's appropriate.
Yeah, yes, I think so.
But what is it that fascinates you so much about this film?
I really couldn't say. I think
And it's definitely a work of art.
Yes, of course.
Because they didn't think they were making art when they were doing it. You know, that's very clear from talking to the crew. They thought they were, you know, it's part of a day's job. It's a film, it's a movie. You know, messages are for the post, but, you know, they didn't see this at all as art.
But you don't have an interview with Carol Reed, do you?
Sorry,
You're talking to the crew, not to Carol Reed, isn't that right?
but they were, I mean, they were
So
very
you know
much,
what he thinks.
yeah, I mean, he wouldn't have seen that either.
That was the question, really.
Yeah, I haven't heard Carol ever describe this as a work of art or in that sort of form, no.
Isn't it always artisan? And great works of film are more like, you know, it's more like an incredibly beautiful couture dress than a kind of an individual's piece of brilliance like the Sistine Chapel or something. Great film is beautiful, brilliant artisan.
But I think what is special about this film, and it's maybe quite a specifically cinematic thing, is that it's a kind of accessible intellectual thriller, you know, and that's, you know, it's no more or less than that, and yet it's an uncommonly intelligent thriller. You know, in terms of its, I mean, one sees with the trailer how it could have been got wrong. You know, it's sort of, you know, one almost doesn't recognise the film from the trailer, you know, and through the kind of candy floss. And if Selznick had had his way, one would have had much more. And even the small changes that he made, it kind of takes away the kind of hard-bitten quality of it. And I was just thinking, I mean, in terms of Harry Lime, I mean, there are things in the film which aren't in the novella, for example, and which, I mean, who is the porter looking at? And I think it must be said that he's looking at Harry. Otherwise, he wouldn't be so surprised. And they're things underneath the surface. So, in other words, however much we may, for whatever reason, be charmed by Welles, you know, and it's very, you know, he has come in the novel with a cutthroat razor and killed the porter and this sort of thing. And so that kind of edginess and the kind of seriousness of that edginess, and yet within a popular genre is what I think makes this film very special. And Welles, of course, works in this mode as well. And it's a rather kind of wonderful, the highbrow thriller, if you like, in this period in cinema is, I'd give it art, maybe small A art.
Well, I think capital A.
Capital A, yep.
Absolutely. I think it is a masterpiece. I think it is, and with Old Man Out, among the great works of the 20th century. I would also say, what we haven't mentioned, I think, is that the genre to which it belongs, it is a thriller, but it is a film noir. And one of the major figures in film noir, which I think is the only one, an exercise of this kind that Selznick made. And it was not he really, one of the problems about it, the film, was Selznick's unenthusiastic involvement in some ways. He wanted to make it into a different film than the one that Greene and Reed wanted to make. He didn't like the particular kind of pessimism. I mean, if you said the film noir is an international, particularly an American form, and it's very much involved with the career of Welles, that one could date the beginning of the film noir from 1941, around the time of The Maltese Falcon and Citizen Kane. And we would say it virtually ended, or the final point would be Welles's last Hollywood film, A Touch of Evil. And the particular characteristics of these films, that they are mostly black and white, they involved people wrongly accused of crime, in innocence, corrupted, women who in fact are involved in the destruction of men. We can see the transformation from the early film noir, the wartime films, which have reflected some problems of, say, the absence of men and the women coming under suspicion for going astray, and the absence of their men. How this is then transformed in the beginning of the McCarthy era and the Cold War into the Third Man. Said also sort of the particular characteristics of the dark streets, just that Wells, so where that Reed was, of course, spraying these streets with water to get this particular effect of shining, dangerous streets, the looming shadows. There are currents in this film of something that you find in sort of the films, the German Expressionist films, which anticipated the film noir in Hollywood, which was the regard of staircases, the way and the particular shadows, the way people looking up and looking down staircases, and this has somehow having a particular sort of I don't know, some sexual significance or forms of alienation of sort of climbing up and going down, kind of moral ascent and descent.
But this is a very British film noir because he runs up the staircase, he's running for his life, Holly Martins, he hides, and then suddenly he has his finger pecked by a parrot.
Yes.
I mean, it's maybe the first parrot sketch before Monty Python. But that, I would say, it's a film noir, absolutely, with all of these elements. But then you have little details like that which make it kind of very British. And they saw it, when Guy describes it, he describes it as a comedy thriller. That's the genre that they thought they were making, and that it was quite safe to kind of almost parody some of these elements, but then also put in elements of comedy, which in a sense I would say is that particular British element.
But one particular element of comedy was cut out quite late in pre-production, that the character, the representative of British Council propaganda man played by Wilfrid Hyde-White Crabbin, was originally written as two men. And this was based, although Greene was very hostile as a critic towards Alfred Hitchcock, he was not above borrowing things from Hitchcock. I mean, the scene in which Holly goes on, is made to deliver the lecture, comes straight out of 39 Steps, as does his escape from the lecture hall. But the two characters that were originally thought of as possibly to be played by Basil Radford and Naunton Wayne, playing the type of dithering Englishman, Charters and Caldecott, from The Lady Vanishes. And there's another, one of Greene's mischievous little jokes directed against Hitchcock is buried in when Kurtz, Baron Kurtz, has his first meeting with Holly and starts to talk to him, in fact making superior European condescending jokes about Westerns and the kind of book that Holly writes. He talks, his last line to him, he said, you are the master of suspense. Now this is a joke at the expense of Hitchcock, which was the sobriquet which had been invented by Hitchcock and his publicists in the early 1930s to promote Hitchcock, and which he used right throughout his career.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And of course, looking at this list of the top 10, Reed indeed got the last laugh, having had his third man over Vertigo. And I think it's been our pleasure to be here as part of these 25th anniversary celebrations, and I think we'd like to wish the Barbican a happy birthday. And I think we're going to be outside if anybody wants to come and speak more about the film. But with that, I'd say thank you to Frederick Baker and Phillip French.